Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Jean-Michel Jarre, Oxygene 3. Jean-Michel Jarre, pioneer of electronic music who changed the genre forever when he made his Oxygene album back in 1976. I've talked about the guy before, as I reviewed both volumes of his electronica project, the first half The Time Machine last year, and the second half The Heart of Noise earlier this year. Now, Electronica 1 The Time Machine broke an 8-year hiatus after his Teo and Tia album, but now it's like he's been scrambling to make up for lost time. 2 Jarre albums in the same year is not something I ever expected. And just like I did with The Orb, I will once again recap my thoughts on Jarre's discography so far, even though I already did that in my Electronica 1 review. Old and harsh, but better than it had any right to be. Old and harsh and also kind of pretty boring. Still a classic. Also one of my favorites, even if not much has changed. Not quite as good as the previous two, but it's good fun. The fact that you can only listen to bootlegs of this album does not work in its favor. Enter experimental Jarre, bringing in lots of voice samples and quirky 80s new wave influences. Also a classic in my eyes. Nothing new, but its bombastic intensity is its main draw. Industrial Revolution is awesome. The rest is pretty good too. The main draw of this one is the 40-minute long ambient piece at the end, and yeah, it's pretty cool overall. Not one of my favorites. I mean, I still like it, but in my opinion, there's nothing here that I couldn't get out of a previous Jarre album. Absolutely worth your time. I know it almost as well as the first. Also one of the guy's absolute best. No thanks. Jarre meets jazz. Yes, please, more of this. Oh, we did get more of this. Just a little more electronic this time. I think I like this one more than most people did. The first half of Jarre's ambitious all-collaboration project is a really fun and varied listen. The second half of Jarre's ambitious all-collaboration project is not as good as the first, but still lots of fun. Which brings us to here, the guy's 20th album to date. Or 19th, depending on whether you count Electronica 1 and 2 as one project or 2 separate albums. Now, just by looking at the title, Jarre is unleashing a highly ambitious project here. It may not seem ambitious, as he's made plenty of music that sounds like his Oxygene album, but that's kind of why it's ambitious. Pulling off a third Oxygene album in 2016, in my opinion, would be highly difficult. Now, on one hand, Jarre actually did manage to pull off making the second volume in the series, Oxygene 7 through 13, highly enjoyable and one of my favorites from him ever. But the reason I like that album as much as I do is because it's not just a straight rehash of the same material we heard on the first Oxygene. It's an actual successful sequel to Oxygene, one that may sound very similar to the first, but builds on that sound and takes it into new territory. Someday I'll probably review this guy's entire discography. Maybe that'll be a project for next year. And I'll talk about Oxygene and Oxygene 713 in more detail then in their own separate videos. But despite my love for both of these albums, I was still highly skeptical going into this third volume. And this is because Jarre has developed somewhat of a formula over all these years. For instance, you may recall me saying I didn't care for Chronology all that much, and while that album's fine on its own merits, yeah, I mean, it is still Jarre doing what he does best. I think it's one of the guy's weakest releases because there's nothing really on it that I feel like I could have gotten out of it from one of his earlier albums, like Equinox, Rendezvous, or Revolutions. My favorite mode of Jarre is the more experimental Jarre, who isn't afraid to add new twists to his usual formula. I much prefer albums like Zuluk, Metamorphoses, and Sessions 2000 to more typical Jarre formula following albums like Rendezvous and Chronology. And here Jarre is again straight telling us that he's turning Oxygene into a trilogy with his latest album. I was both excited and worried. Excited because I loved the first two, but worried because I didn't know if I'd like this new one. So I went into Oxygene 3 with high hopes that it could at least be up to the same standards as the other two. The same very high standards, but I just hoped I'd like it. Suspense was real. How did it turn out? Okay, I was tossing this one about in my head for a while. I mean, Jarre isn't like Deadmau5, where I felt like I knew where I was at with him with basically just one listen. But no, I had to listen to this latest Jarre and really sit down and think about it for a few days. It's been out for 3 days now, and maybe I'm jumping the gun by covering it now, but I think I've more or less pinned down what I think about this album overall. First of all, let me talk about my first reactions to it. When I first heard this album and Oxygene Part 14 came on, I heard the almost Deadmau5-like synth progression and the electric piano keys, and I was hooked instantly. This album constantly had me on the edge of my seat, waiting for what would happen next. The entire thing felt like it was one gigantic build-up, and I was like, oh boy, any second now, he's going to break into an awesome trance climax like something like some of the stuff on Oxygene 713, and that never really happened. The entire thing felt like one huge build-up and never really had a climax, and there weren't that many drum sounds, and whenever they were there, they were rather light and breezy, and didn't really seem to deliver on the payoff that the rest of the music seemed to promise me. But I kept listening and thinking about it more, and then I realized, wait a second. The original Oxygene kind of did that too, didn't it? The most beat-centric tracks on that album, parts 2 and 4, are not even close to as intense as the more intense moments on 713, like part 8 or 10 or 11. Maybe that meant the picture I had in mind of what this album would sound like was actually more based off of my love for Oxygene 713 than it was the original Oxygene. And then it finally hit me what this album was all about when I actually saw a negative review of this album on iTunes. They said that they were waiting for something cool to happen and it never did, and that they were disappointed because Jarre had said that he wanted this album to sound like what Oxygene would be like if it came out in 2016. And then I thought, of course, yes, that's what it is. This album isn't so much a sequel that builds upon the ideas of both the previous Oxygene albums, it's more trying to recreate the experience of the original Oxygene to fit within the world of electronic music that exists in 2016. And now that I figured that out, this album makes so much more sense. Because over the course of this album, it wasn't like I wasn't interested or Jarre wasn't doing anything cool. I was basically waiting for Armin to pop in from out of nowhere and send everything flying at high speed, and in retrospect that would be kinda stupid. But the one thing that I did notice is that this album did feel very new and fresh, since Jarre had access to much better equipment than there was available in 1976 and 1997 respectively. He wasn't imitating new styles, he was just using newer equipment that made everything sound a lot clearer and in focus than the original, which now just seems a tad dated by comparison. The fact that this album finally made the original Oxygene sound a tad dated is something unbelievable in its own right. And, again, when you really get down to it, there's plenty of cool and interesting ideas that I was having a ton of fun listening to, just nothing that with a particularly heavy beat behind it. Heck, there was even some actual climaxes that I'd been looking for that I somehow missed on first listen. Especially in part 16, there's some really intense moments in that track. And part 17 is kinda like this album's equivalent to part 4 from the original. It's lots of fun, gets my foot tapping, has me humming along with the catchy melody. Part 18, on the other hand, is extremely peaceful and tranquil, kind of like being surrounded by a pad of warm angelic synths. There's actually quite a bit of variety, even if the songs blend together very seamlessly. And part 20, oh man, there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of huge organs in the beginning that come at full force and then kind of die down, and then come back in full force. And this intro to part 20 is easily the most suspenseful moment on the whole album. But after that, everything just kind of floats away. We get all these weird subtle effects floating around. We get a straight sample of Oxygene part 6. And then the ending is basically just one long orchestral swell before finally ending what sounds like a campfire crackling. On that first listen, I thought Jarre was almost trolling me, teasing me by hanging that climax I wanted right over my head but not actually giving it to me. But you know what? It's an excellent ending to this album. And that's not all. As I kept listening to this album, I started to notice that this album actually does take more of the ideals of Oxygene 713 than I had initially thought. It's especially noticeable on part 19, which, while not one of the more standout parts, It made me notice that this entire album was moving at a much faster pace than the original Oxygene, as if inspired a little bit by the faster pace of 713. It may not have been as fast, which is why I didn't notice at first, but the ingredients are all there. So, those are my thoughts on Oxygene 3. Overall, while I didn't know what to think of this album at first, it's one that's continually been surprising me as I've listened to it more and more. And you know what? I think in the end, this has turned out to be among Jarre's top tier work. Even on first listen, while I'll admit it wasn't what I expected on the outset, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't completely taken in by basically every moment on this album, and it didn't hit all the same emotional spots that the other two Oxygene albums did. For now, it's certainly my least favorite of the Oxygene trilogy, but I have listened to the living crap out of the other two, and this one's only been out for a few days. There's a nostalgia factor that goes into my knowing the first two so well that obviously isn't here yet, and probably won't arrive for a long time, but honestly, after thinking it through for a couple of days, I think this album well deserves to be called Oxygene 3 and lives up to the legacy that the original 1976 classic left behind. I think it's Jarre's best album since Sessions 2000. Just awesome. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.